Once again, Shabbat Shalom. I invite you at this time, you can close your prayer books and turn your attention to the supplemental sheet, which is called Tu B'Av, What's the Deal? If you have not received a supplemental sheet, we have them at the front table near the caddy of prayer books. Tu B'Av, what's the deal? Not my words actually from the Babylonian Talmud. So because I have the microphone, and it is a corded, not a cordless microphone, I'm dating myself here, I'm not going to do the Phil Donahue thing, and go out into the congregation, also because of the live streamers and the camera. So I'm going to stay focused right up here, but I do invite interaction through this Devar Torah. This is intended to be a little bit of a shiur or a mini study as opposed to a frontal sermon. We are looking this week at texts and traditions around Tu B'Av, the holiday of love. It just so happens, this does not happen every year, it did happen this year, that the holiday of love corresponds to the Torah portion when we read words of love, ve'ahavta, as we heard tonight, so gorgeously rendered in a creative setting by Isaac. We're going to look beginning on the front side of the page, which includes the text of Mishnah Ta'anit 4:8. Those of you who've been studying Mishnah with me for the last couple of years know what this book is. It is the first large-form compendium of rabbinic thinking about how to live a Jewish life. It reflects the first 2.5 or so centuries of rabbinic wisdom compiled sometime by around the year 235 by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince. And section Ta'anit is all about fast days and the relationship between Jewish fast days and rainfall. Remember that unlike ancient Egypt, which depended upon the overflowing of the banks of the Nile as its principal source of irrigation and therefore agriculture. By the way, in antiquity as today, if you go to Egypt today, all major Egyptian population centers are along the Nile. It's a big country, but almost nobody lives east of the Nile because it's all the Sahara Desert. Everything in Egypt is based in and around the Nile River. I know this because I was in Cairo in February of 2020 and got to really see up close how Egypt is constituted. So in Israel, by contrast, ancient and modern, all agriculture is dependent on rainfall. There is no major body of fresh water to irrigate the land, and therefore Israelite agriculture was much more a game of chance with agriculture until irrigation was developed. Therefore, religious fasts would be imposed on the population as a way of propitiating God and saying, if we fast, if we deprive ourselves, will you please bring the rains to nourish our land and therefore stir the growth of our crops. That's the context for Mishnah Ta'anit. What does that have to do with tonight's passage? Well, as often happens in rabbinic literature, almost nothing. Rabbinic literature goes down lots of rabbit holes, and this is one of them. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said, there were no festival days in Israel greater than, and if I had just asked you to turn the page over and fill in the blank, how many of you would have picked Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur as Israel's happiest festival days? Right, not a hand goes up. Right, thank you, Rabbi Citron. And you would have justified it too, because that's what makes you a rabbi. But most of us mortals would have said something like Passover, Sukkot, maybe Hanukkah, not Yom Kippur, not a particularly festive day in the way we think of it, and certainly not the obscure little observance of Tu B'Av, Jewish Valentine's Day. What is Tu B'Av? It goes on to say, on those days, especially meaning Tu B'Av, the daughters of Jerusalem will go out in white garments. I didn't mention this before. We see some people wearing white garments tonight. Thank you for dressing up for Tu B'Av. Thank you for dressing up for Tu B'Av. White garments that they had borrowed in order not to shame anyone who had none. This was not like, well, let me just say, High Holidays in Scarsdale, for instance. It's not a fashion show, right? You show up in a borrowed shmata so as not to shame somebody who could not afford the Jerusalem ancient equivalent of Prada. Okay, so you put on a borrowed shmata, not Prada. Shmata, not Prada. I like that. I'm going to work on that. the daughters of Jerusalem would come out and dance in the vineyards. What would they say? They would say, young man, lift up your eyes and see what you choose for yourself. It was taught one who did not have a wife would turn there to find one. So it was J-Date. It was, there's a newish app, Bagel Meets Locks, something like that, right? Definitely by Jews, for Jews. Most dating apps were developed by Jews, by the way. Okay, that's a different story for a different Shabbos. I also want to say that if you would like some more reflections on this subject of Jewish matchmaking and the meaning of Tu B'Av in a modern context, I wrote a short little think piece for this week's e-blast, in which I made it clear that the values of WRT and the way in which we want to sanctify the love that can be felt and experienced and expressed between two people is not exclusively relegated to the heteronormative. So if you would like to know more on my thoughts on that, you can read them. Please excuse the Mishnah for being a product of its time, a patriarchal time, a time in which heteronormativity is, in fact, the norm. So the matchmaking that was authorized by the Jewish community was between one woman and one man. The next text from the Babylonian Talmud on the same part of the Mishnah, Ta'anit. It says, the 15th day of Av, what's the deal? That is my translation, but it's faithful to what the Hebrew says. It says, you have to turn it over if you want to see the Hebrew. Oh, no, you don't. It's right above it. Ele chamisha asar be'av. In other words, these 15 days of Av, or this 15th day of Av, maihi. It's sort of Aramaic Hebrew. And it means, what's up? What's up with that? What's the deal with Tu B'Av? So it seems that we have this practice. The Mishnah says, here is what people do on Tu B'Av. We know how it is practiced. We know that women borrow some white shmatas, they go out, they prance around, hopefully somebody swipes right. Do you swipe left or right? I don't know. I've been married for a long time. I don't remember whether you swipe left or right. We didn't have apps when I got married. But the rabbis want to know, where does it come from? What is the precipitating event in Jewish memory that gives us an annual calendar observance of love? Every holiday has a biblical reason for its existence, right? Sukkot is associated with the memory of our people dwelling in booths as we made our way through the wilderness. Pesach is associated with the memory of the Exodus from Egypt. Purim is associated with the memory of the persecution by Achashverosh and his prime minister Haman. Boo, thank you. So every Jewish holiday has some kind of biblical memory associated with it. What is the biblical memory of Tu B'Av? It's a holiday without a memory. And so the rabbis, of course, invent one. Their explanation is really an invention. And it is proof that it is invention by the fact that there are probably 5 or 6 reasons that are given in this section of the Talmud. I've just extracted my favorite 2 or 3. Rav Shmuel said, this was the day on which the members of different tribes were permitted to intermarry with one another. Okay, take that in for a moment. This is the day on which the tribes were permitted to intermarry with one another, which suggests what about life before Tu B'Av? Property rights? Okay, it could well be that the tribes had a very distinctive sense of self-sovereignty and therefore were invested in maintaining, upholding, and perpetuating their own intra-tribal property rights. The assumption being, of course, what, though? I mean, I'm actually looking for something less specific. What was life like for the Jewish people before the original Tu B'Av came along? Somebody said it. They didn't intermarry. And this is not interfaith marriage. This is intertribal Jewish marriage, right? This is the mother of a Reubenite boy saying, I will not allow my son, the Reubenite, to marry that vile daughter of a Zebulunite. Can any Jewish people relate to this kind of mentality? Forget about interfaith marriage, right? Right? Okay. We would never let our Sephardic family marry into an Ashkenazic family. We are German Jews. There is no way we're going to marry the Galicianers or the Lithuanian Jews, right? Yeah, Audrey's nodding, right? Well, okay, what was the story in your family in a nutshell? Okay, I'm gonna repeat this. Audrey says her eventual father-in-law, your dad rather, referred to his eventual son-in-law, Richard, who's sitting beside you. So obviously this Tu B'Av matchup worked, right? Won't say for how many years, but it's been a while. But when first introducing your Bashert, the one you intended to marry, to your dad, he says he's an Eastern Jew. You corrected him, said, no, he's from Austria. His retort was, those Austrian Jews were all over the place. Okay, so, yes, hyper-provinciality. It happens to be a long-standing Jewish attribute. This text makes it clear that Tu B'Av is the day associated with, you know what, I think we're going to relax our guard a little bit. Maybe it would be good for the Jewish people, it would certainly be good for our gene pool, to mix it up outside of our own tribe. Turn the page. A different possible explanation. Rav Yosef said that Rab Nachman said, the 15th of Av was the day on which the tribe of Benjamin was permitted to, it should really be, re-enter the congregation of the Jewish people. As it is stated, and the men of Israel had sworn in Mitzpah, a city, that none of us shall give his daughter to a Benjaminite as a wife, from Judges chapter 21. Background. I'm not going to give it to you. It is so horrifying that I can't even talk about it at a Shabbat service. But if you want to know the background, go home this weekend and read in your Bible Judges chapters 19, 20, and 21. It is not suitable for young audiences. But basically, the Benjaminite tribe is implicated in a crime so grievous that the rest of the tribes of Israel basically expel them and say, we will not allow our children to intermarry with Benjaminites. Again, if you want to know why, Judges chapters 19 to 21. However, this prohibition is not forever. There is a day in which the Benjaminites are allowed to re-enter the larger congregation of the Jewish people, and that day, say the rabbis, must have been Tu B'Av, Jewish Love Day. What did they expound? In other words, what was the explanation that enabled them to dissolve this oath? Rav said, one of the great teachers of the Talmud, they understood the verse literally. When the men in Bible time said, not one of us shall enter into a relationship with the Benjaminites, they said, not one of us. They did not actually intend to prohibit their children, which is what is stated here. That is to say, the oath applied only to the generation that took the initial oath, not to their descendants, and therefore could be annulled. So Tu B'Av is associated now in two separate texts with Jewish tribes relaxing their guard and saying, you know what? We're going to go outside our comfort zone. Maybe we can marry somebody who's not exactly like ourselves. Maybe even somebody from a tribe with an old negative reputation. Old business, skeletons in the closet. We're going to put it aside and say, it's a different world. The kids are growing up. The kids are falling in love with the people they want to fall in love with. We're not going to stand in their way. If any of this sounds like it might be relevant in your life, in the life of your children, in the life of your parents, somewhere in your extended family story, I'm willing to guess every single family in this tent tonight has a family story that sounds a little bit like this. Okay. It's a trait of the Jewish people. I'm going to read two more. Rabbi Bar Barchana said that Rabbi Yochanan said, the 15th of Av was the day on which the deaths of the Israelites in the wilderness ceased, as the Master taught. During the entire time that the deaths of those in the wilderness had not yet ceased, the divine word did not communicate with Moses, as it says, and so when all those warriors had finally died, did the Eternal speak to me. This was last week's Torah portion. Moses is giving his final address to the people of Israel. And what is implied here is that for a long time in Moses' leadership of the community through the wilderness, God wasn't talking to Moses. And the reason is because the Israelites had yet to die out to give rise to a new generation. And what is the day on which the last of the old slave Israelites with their old slave mentality died out, allowing a new generation of Israelites to rise and take their place and proudly march into the promised land? That day was Tu B'Av, the day in which we were liberated from the old in order to give way to the new. And the final explanation, Ula of Bir-A'ah said that Rabbi Elazar said, I love how the Talmud quotes its teachers, in the future, meaning not just next Tuesday, but in the messianic future, the future of a world redeemed, the Holy One, blessed be God, will arrange a dance of the righteous, and God will sit among them in the Garden of Eden, and each and every one, in the dance that is, will point to God with a finger, as it is stated, and it shall be said on that day, behold, this is our God for whom we waited in order to save us. This is the eternal for whom we waited. We will be glad and rejoice in salvation. So I brought this one in, first of all, because it's the end of the entire Talmudic tractate. It's the final word. But more importantly, because it wants to suggest that the meaning of Tu B'Av is not that its origin is in the past, but actually the true meaning of Tu B'Av is that it points to some distant future. In other words, why do we have a day of the calendar dedicated to human love? Not so much because it is associated with lifting ancient intermarriage taboos within tribes, not so much because it's associated with a new generation of Israelites rising to take its place and enter the promised land, but actually we celebrate Tu B'Av not because of what was, but because of what could be, which is the redemption of all creation. And on that day, as we'll say, God shall be one and God's name shall be one. We do this all the time in prayer. We are always pointing to not only a past, but also an imagined future of a world made whole. A world that, unlike the way it is instead the way it ought to be. Judaism is a future-oriented tradition. For all of our talk about tradition and honoring the past and remembering our ancestors, and with all that, Judaism is a future-looking tradition. And what it wants to say about Tu B'Av, I believe, and on this note I'll conclude, is that the experience of people falling in love, committing themselves in love to each other, is actually pointing at the possibility of all humanity living in love and relationship with the divine. And on that day, God shall be one, God's name shall be one, and let us say, Amen.